Hello, welcome to Picture Me Coding with Eric Aker and Mike Mull. Hi, Mike. Nice to see you again.
Hey there.
Mike, it's now summer, and I have maybe a personal failing, which is that every summer I am transported back mentally to the summers I spent in Hawaii with my grandmother. I would spend a month in Hawaii with her, and people in our family and our family friends all summer long would listen to a style of music they called island music. The rest of the world seems to call this music reggae, and every summer I find myself listening to. It's not a purposeful thing. It's like this hole that I fall into.
It's not just all ukulele.
It's not all No, it's not all ukulele, not all slide key guitar. There's that too. Island music. It just seems to happen to me. It's like a thing that happens. It's not intentional. Anyway, I discovered that happened again this summer when last week I found I was listening to this Protege album, In Search of Zion. Protege's album came out last year. He was busy last year. He wrote a children's book called Here Comes the Morning, too. I really liked his record, Ancient Future. It came out in 2015. I couldn't call myself a committed and knowledgeable fan of reggae and dancehall, but I find that I get sucked into certain records and then I listen to them for a long time afterwards. And Ancient Future was like that. So I started listening to this album In Search of Zion. It's pretty good. I like about half of it. But now here we are in summer and I'm listening to island music again, not on purpose, just a thing that happens to me.
I will have to check that out. I have to confess that is something I have essentially no experience with, no knowledge of.
What are you listening to lately?
So my choice this week is a little bit kind of meta. So it's not a particular piece of music. There's a guy named Evan Goldfine, and he's doing this project this year called A Year of Bach. It's kind of a blog thing, but he sends out an email about once a week or so with stuff that he's been listening to, and he's kind of trying to go through, a substantial fraction of Bach's massive catalog. So it varies quite a bit. Some of it I really like. Some of it has been a little bit too weird for me, but
too weird. Bach, too weird.
There was one album that was pieces on a mean-tempered harpsichord. I don't know. It doesn't. It sounds like the harpsichord is in a bad mood, but it apparently has something to do with the tuning. And about half the pieces in there sound like they are out of tune to somebody in the 21st century. So
it's kind of like Alice Coltrane does Bach or something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting intellectually, but not something I would probably listen to. There was one album though that was harpsichord and violin pieces that's just really beautiful that I've been listening to a lot. So anyway, I recommend it. If you search for Evan Goldfine, you'll probably find this project, and you can subscribe to the emails that he sends out on a periodic basis if you're a Bach nerd. And he makes links to Spotify and iTunes and Bandcamp, I think. So it's worthwhile thing if you're a Bach nerd.
I hope you're not going to hate this comment, but I am not a Bach nerd, and I don't think you sold me on it just then, seeking out this Evan Goldfine Year of Bach thing.
Yeah, well, it's definitely it's definitely something for Bach lovers, not sort of an introduction to Bach sort of thing.
I kind of like coffee shop Bach. That's my thing. Going in the coffee shop, playing in the background. That's my depth of affection for that music.
Yeah, I'm cool with that. I grew up on, Where Sheep May Safely Graze on repeat sort of thing. So, but yeah, this is it's more something for people who are already into this music and just want to discover a little bit more of the catalog.
All right, fair. If you're a Bach nerd, how many of our audience are High on Fire fans and Bach nerds?
I guess it's probably half.
Okay. All right. I like imagining these beautiful Venn diagrams.
Yeah.
You wrote a blog post recently that I read. I thought it was good. Maybe it sounds self-serving to be like, "Oh, my co-host wrote this great blog post." But I read it as a if I could speak objectively about it, I thought, "Wow, this is pretty good." And I want to characterize your argument because I wanted to talk more about this week. So I'm going to try to characterize your argument. I want you to tell me a little bit about where this perspective comes from. You can tell me if my characterization is right. So, what I get from your post, it's called The End of Full Stack. The era of the full stack developer is over, is what you're saying. You're saying there's stacks still around, but there's so much stuff around them, infrastructure and technology, that you can't claim to be full stack. And if you claim that, it's really just misleading. So you have to either accept that there's stuff that exists around you that helps you, so you don't need to have deep knowledge of those areas. So, like infrastructure as code and observability, or you got a platform that does stuff for you. So you're really arguing that our ability to say that there is a thing called a full stack developer has eroded to such a degree that it's now just completely misleading to use that term. How am I doing? Did I care? I thought this was provocative, but maybe I'm mischaracterizing what you're saying.
No, that's a pretty good summary. I myself am not clear if this is a particularly hot take or if it's just something that everybody agrees on now. But I guess what sort of prompted this is two things. One is if you look at, I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn these days, and it's not because I'm necessarily looking for jobs. It's because I'm kind of looking for what the industry is doing.
Hmm.
And if you look at the scope of jobs that are being offered, there's still a huge number of full stack engineer, full stack developer job ads. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is I've been doing some work with GPUs and uh, you know deep learning in particular running on GPUs, and I
Hmm.
sort of came to this conclusion that not only are things getting so specialized, but there's a sense in which you like when I started out working in this industry, it was kind of the desktop computer era,
Hmm.
and you could do the same programming at home on your desktop that people were doing in a commercial environment, more or less. And now there's situations where if you want to do certain types of work, you really can't do it from home. You have to use a cloud provider or you have to work for a particular company. And so there's the sort of generalist hacker that I could have been 35 years ago just isn't really a thing anymore.
So you started doing Windows stuff and working with Java in the early 2000s, but you did web stuff early on too, right?
Yeah, I guess it depends on how how you web. I had exposure to the web in the 90s, and I was around at the beginning of the Java applet era and stuff like that, and did some CGI bin stuff in the 90s. But there was this period in the early 2000s where I was doing mostly Windows stuff and a little bit of client server Java work up until, I don't know, 2003 or so.
Hmm.
And so didn't really think of myself as a web application programmer.
Hmm.
And then soon after that, I started working for a company that did, it was just like a streaming music service. And so, I was officially in the web world then, but I was doing mostly back end stuff because, my area was music recommendations. And when that company was bought by a large internet company, stuck around there for a few years. And then one of my good friends, he went off to this ad tech company, and he said, "Hey, you should apply here." And so I said, "Okay, I'll give it a shot." And they sort of gave me this take home problem to do, and it was a totally front end project.
Wow. So
And
they looked at your resume. They said, wow, this guy's done Windows, Java, music recommendations. Let's have him do a front end web project as a take home project.
yeah, it was surprising to me, and also I just had no idea what I was doing.
Wait,
Um,
wait, wait, wait. Can we put a pause in? What was about what years would this have been? Because I want to guess what the front end web would have been like at that time.
it was probably at this point late 2006, early 2007,
Oh,
maybe
geez.
a
I was going to
little bit later.
say, well, I thought you were going to be like 2008, 2009. I was thinking jQuery, maybe Backbone. When did Backbone start? Backbone 2011, one of the first JavaScript. Oh no, there were earlier frameworks. Geez, I can't even remember their names now. I'm
Yeah, I mean,
dating
I know
myself.
my friend used Moot
Moo
Moot
Tools.
Tools.
That's
Yeah,
right. And there was one that started with a Y. What was it called? I can't even remember what it was called.
yeah, yeah. I'd have to search the archives, but
Okay, sorry, I interrupted you. So they gave you this take home project to do a front end web stuff. This is like
yeah,
2006. What did they want you to
yeah.
do? Do you remember?
I don't remember the particulars of it, but it was just sort of basically to verify that you knew the front end, and at that point, front end was starting to mean Ajaxy stuff,
Hmm.
and not
XHR requests.
yeah, not just HTML and uh, request response type of stuff, but Ajaxy. And I just had no clue, so I did this Ajaxy thing like pure JavaScript, and it was a train wreck. And needless to say, I didn't get that job, but that kind of put me in that path. And I started to learn that stuff and got relatively competent with jQuery by 2008 or so.
jQuery was hot at that time. 2009, 2010 was a big deal. It was
Yeah,
a way to target all kinds of weird browsers. Different browser stacks at the time were a nightmare to deal with.
yeah, I really like jQuery. I was perfectly happy with that, and um, I don't know. So anyway, there was a period there for probably 4 or 5 years where I was using. I would have called myself a full stack developer,
Hmm.
and I was doing what I consider to be full stack work.
Well, Angular JS would have been what, 2011, 2012, I think is when it came out. Did you go to that from jQuery? Did you use it back like a backbone or Angular JS?
Yeah, there was one place where I used Backbone, and it was around that time where I started to realize, these front end frameworks are getting complicated enough that it's really difficult to be an expert in both front end and back end.
Hmm.
So especially when I like from 2009 to 2013 or so, I was using mostly Django. And when you're using Django, you can feel like you're a full stack person, regardless of how competent you are on the JavaScript side. But
Or even the
uh,
Python side. Not to diss Django developers, but you could write a lot of Django without thinking too Python-y if you want.
yeah, fair enough. But yeah, once people started doing Angular, it just felt like there was now a front end specialty and a back end specialty, and I was
Mm.
probably going to veer toward the back end.
Mm.
So um, at this point, I would consider myself to be pretty exclusively back end, and would feel a little bit awkward about advertising myself as a full stack guy.
Hmm. From your essay, you wrote this line that I thought was interesting. And from your personal story, you're saying in your own case, it was over 10 years ago where you stopped thinking of yourself as a full stack guy. And in your essay, you're talking now, 2024. My thinking has evolved on this topic. I now believe that it's no longer really possible to be a full stack developer, even though there are dozens of organizations promising to train people to become one and hundreds of job ads seeking to hire one. So you're not just saying for myself, I don't want to claim this. You're saying for other people, it's not quite fraudulent, but not quite accurate way of portraying yourself. It cannot be, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I don't deny that there are still people who do front end and back end work semi competently. I mean, you're one of them, obviously.
I
Um,
don't know. I was gonna. All right. Well, let's leave me out of it for now.
um, but I think when people started looking at full stack developers, or started that as sort of an idea of a job title, I liked it from my personal experience being sort of a generalist and somebody who is self taught. I really like the idea of being able to do a little bit of everything to make this entire application. And I confess that there are still people who have skills on the front end and skills on the back end, and maybe some database knowledge and so forth. But I also think at this point, that's not really all that relevant, because it just means that you are slightly less specialized than the other specialized people working in a particular project.
So you really can't be expert in all things, is I think what you're implying. You brought to me this essay called The Myth of the Full Stack Developer. And I thought it was similar to what you're saying here. Like you liked being able to call yourself a full stack developer. There was this empowerment in that. I can bootstrap a complete app entirely independently. I don't need anybody's help. I can build the
Right.
entire thing, front end, back end. I can get it out there in the world.
And that was exactly what we did in, 2009. You could sit down, write the back end, write some front end code, deploy that to a Linux server, and make it available to the outside world all as a single individual.
Mm-hmm. And there's a feeling of empowerment. I just mentioned about that. Like, wow, I can do everything. I don't necessarily need anybody else. I'll start from scratch and I'll have a working complete thing. In this essay, The Myth of the Full Stack Developer from CodeMotion, the line I liked was, over time, I realized that the allure of this definition, full stack developer, has captured the hearts of many people, mainly due to a common belief. Being full stack means being a complete programmer. And for companies, hiring a full stack developer represents added value. Is that what it means, being complete? You are a complete developer and you provide value to a company in that way?
I totally agree with the idea that that's the allure of it. And I think that was, the intention in the early days, uh, was that you could do essentially everything. And then that made you both a better rounded programmer and somebody that was valuable to companies because they could hire one person,
Mm-hmm.
or they could hire multiple people with those skills, and those people could trade around on the things they were working on. So there was no, you could put them on different projects and they would still bring the different skills to that project. So
Mm-hmm. There's a few things underneath what we're saying here. You're sort of arguing that stuff has gotten more complex in the last 10, 15 years. It's gotten so complex, in fact, that you can't just accurately declare that you are full stack. This is similar to what shows up in this essay. The term is now too inflated, this author writes. And when written on the resume of a junior programmer, it adds no value. So we like the idea of being full stack. It's this empowering feeling that we have about our ability to bootstrap and build apps from scratch. There was this era, maybe 15, 20 years of the developer, the software engineer as a kind, almost like a hero of our culture. They can appear and spawn businesses and software spontaneously from their brains, and suddenly they've got a company. And that allure, that heroism or whatever, that like that myth maybe it seems to be fading. It's lost its sheen in the last couple of years. But it also could be that you and I can't put myself in your category, we've been around long enough that we know there's a lot of stuff we don't know. Maybe that's what's going on here. Once you've been around long enough, you start to see, oh, I don't know all these things. I will say this. When I think about starting projects now, I think about front end and back end. If they're my own projects or projects for friends or family, I think to myself, geez, I don't have a lot of time. How can I reduce to almost zero the amount of effort I'm putting into one component on this project? And I do think, wow, if I'm gonna work on a full front end for this, it's going to be a huge amount of effort, and a full back end for this, huge amount of effort. Let me just sort of tamp it down to virtually nothing.
to be fair, I think that even at the time when this term was developed, it was probably a little bit misleading to say that one person could do everything. I mean, a lot of the companies that I worked for at that time did have systems people. I rarely had to spin up my own databases, for example.
Mm-hmm.
The network connections to the outside world were established by other people. I guess, my take now is that if you do some front end and you do some back end and you know a little bit of database, perhaps that is valuable, but it's ignoring DevOps, it's ignoring CI/CD pipelines, it's ignoring observability. There's just so much that's going on around the applications. It's either done by a specialist or is done by the platform for you that I think the term is either not that useful or potentially, like the guys implying in the Code Motion essay, it's maybe a little bit laughable if
Oof.
you see it on certain people's resumes.
Yes, I guess we should try to define it a little more strictly. When I think of full stack, the ideas, the abstract areas of knowledge that leap to mind are databases. And maybe your question as I start reeling these off is, well, but how much? How much knowledge? So databases and how deep, deploying code, and again, how deep, back end, HTTP, web service stuff, and front end. And that back end HTTP web service stuff can also be applied to maybe data engineering, but we're just talking full stack, and full stack is probably client server applications, mostly deployed via web today. Databases, deployments, back end, front end. Is there anything I'm missing that you would want to include if somebody were really going to be a complete full stack developer?
Do you mean now or in
I mean,
the
right now,
right
2024,
now?
is there any other piece of knowledge somebody would need that is not covered by these abstract categories? Databases, deploying code, maybe I'm lumping infrastructure in there. You use observability. I'd put that in there. Databases, deploying, back end, and front end. There's nothing else, right?
I think it depends a little bit on what you mean by deploying. There was a time when, for me, working in, say, a startup company, deploying something meant that I would have to spin up my own machines and my own databases. And
And you're going to go and like slash Etsy on Linux and do a bunch of junk. That's what you're talking about. Like you're
but
going to write config files and stuff.
potentially, or, at least, write something to, what's that AWS language that everybody hates? I can't
Cloud
remember.
Formation.
CloudFormation. Yeah, write some
Sorry
CloudFormation.
if you love it. I think we're getting good at offending at least one person in every episode now.
Yeah.
Wait, though. But so my contention is you seized on deployment, which is fair. I don't disagree with what you said. My contention is you could do that on any of these categories. You said it depends on what you mean by deployments. And I think you could say it depends on what you mean by X, where X is databases, or X is backend, or X is front end. All of
Yeah.
those topics.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, databases in particular,
Yes.
when I started doing web programming, I came to that with far, far more extensive database experience than most web programmers do. So I would say I was pretty close to expert with SQL by the time I started doing that. And I could spin up my own, MySQL instance or whatever. I'd been working with Postgres since the late 90s,
Mm.
which probably makes me something of a rarity. But so yeah, but I worked with people who are full stack developers who really were relying on, say, the ORM and Django to do the database side of
Yeah.
stuff.
Well, I
They
mean,
might.
you said, "Oh, and you're a full stack developer," talking to me, and I'm thinking, well, but my database knowledge is like, I can look at a database and I can look at some inefficient queries and go, "Oh, we should add some indexes here," but I'm not really going to write these PostgreSQL CTE file. I mean, I could look up the syntax, like I look at the data engineering interview process that a buddy of ours who we work with, he sometimes will talk about, and I think, wow, I would get 20% of these questions right, 30% of these questions right. I know enough database stuff to be able to optimize it roughly for a web application. I know how to look up the things I don't know. I would not call myself an expert on databases.
Yeah, and I think that's typical of all full stack developers. Well, most. I'm sure there are people who have deep expertise in all the levels, but I think it's always been the case that people were much better at certain layers than other
Mm-hmm.
other layers.
Mm-hmm. So, what's the likelihood that someone could truly be an expert in each of these categories? It's probably pretty low likelihood. Would you agree with that? I guess maybe a different way to say it is what would it take to claim expertise in each thing? You just said I'm pretty expert, or I was in databases.
So for me, if you can go from nothing to a deployed web application, you can probably legitimately call yourself a full stack developer still. I think that's, there's obviously many more ways to do that than there
Mm-hmm.
were 15 years ago.
And it
But
depends on your volume too, right? If you got very low traffic versus very massive traffic, the problem set is different.
that's a whole another specialty now, dealing with auto scaling and streaming and things that are necessary for scale.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, if you can go into a place and they want a web app that lets people register themselves on your website, and you can start with nothing and put that on the public internet. You can probably call yourself a full stack developer. But even that now, like we've talked recently about this Cloudflare dev platform and how nice it is in terms of being able to do a lot of stuff for you.
Cloudflare
Um,
Pages, maybe what you're referring to.
yeah, Cloudflare.
Cloudflare Workers for serverless stuff on the edge.
Yeah, we've both recently, you introduced me to it, and we both recently deployed stuff using that, which for all practical purposes, you could call web applications.
Mm-hmm.
They're not super sophisticated, but they look good and they're deployed to the outside world. But there's so much there that the platform was doing for me. I didn't have to get a certificate to use HTTPS. I just basically pointed the platform at my GitHub repo and it did most of the deployment for me. So I technically deployed a web app, but would that be considered a full stack developer effort? I don't know.
Hmm.
It seems to me like a lot of a lot of shortcuts happened there.
Yeah, I think in a whole field of deploying code, there's cloud specialization, and that's an extremely deep topic. So, can you imagine just hiring somebody who says, "Well, yes, I'm an expert on just cloud A or cloud B or multiple clouds"? Those people definitely exist, but that's a kind of rarefied skill as well. And as the way in which we deployed has changed, the knowledge required has changed. It used to be AWS. We had auto scaling groups. We had load balancers. We had ALB and ELB, and then we had a bunch of virtual machines, and we would kind of scale up or scale down, and we would figure out how to get our code mushed onto those servers in some way and some reliable way. Hopefully, this is where you had the Ansible and the Salt Stack and the Puppets and the Chefs and stuff like that. And then now you've got a lot of serverless deployments and you've got a lot of Kubernetes deployments. And so Kubernetes is a whole specialization in itself. And incumbent upon someone who's going into this is broader knowledge about what's my network segmentation and things like DNS, right? I mean, that's a lot of knowledge that someone would potentially have to claim expertise on to be a full stack developer. Not only just building like Docker images and configuring Linux machines anymore, which is great knowledge to have too, but the amount of things in just the stack of I'm deploying code is massive. And then you've got third-party services, you've got log aggregation, you've got observability, very, very large field today.
Yeah, I think one thing that is maybe not obvious to people now is that when the cloud stuff was new, there were not things like RDS or managed databases. There was no Docker. Well, I guess Docker was maybe no. I guess 2008, 2009. It was still pre-Docker. So the way people did cloud in the early days was you were basically spinning up virtual machines of various sizes, and they were just plain vanilla virtual machines, and then you would install your own software on them.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was really not radically different than putting things in a colo center or having a rack of servers in your building. So that whole world has changed so dramatically over the last 10 or 15 years that it's almost a different field than it was then.
Yeah, I agree with you. So I started with these 4 categories: databases, deployment, front end, back end, and we already muddied the water quite a bit just for databases and deploying. If we just leave those aside, what if we just talk about just web back end and web front end? Is it possible to be expert on these today? I saw a post from Daniel Stenberg, the creative curl, this week. He was talking on Mastodon about HTTP protocol. And he wrote on Mastodon, this is his post: "On this day 10 years ago, we lost our innocence as the former single page HTTP 1.1 spec RFC 2616 exploded," he writes in quotes, "into 6 separate new documents, RFC 7230 and family. We could then no longer pretend HTTP was a simple protocol." So he's talking about 2014. They exploded the HTTP 1.1 spec into 6 separate new documents. He says 2 years ago, in June 2022, it was again updated, RFC 9110 and family. The spec is now split up into 5 main documents: semantics, caching, and separate specs for each version: 1.1, 2, 3. Daniel Stenberg, in this post, the last sentence he concludes with is, those 5 documents hold 143,000 words combined. HTTP is not easy.
Yeah. Yeah. When you have to be a specialist in HTTP just to understand what's going on, it's hard to argue that you have deep knowledge of all the layers of the stack. I guess it's one of those things where you sort of have to decide, where the level is that you have to understand. Like in the real world, do you have to know quantum mechanics to understand why grass is green? I I don't know. Maybe,
Is
maybe.
the quantum mechanics involved in why grass is green? Probably. I don't know. I don't have a clue.
It is, but do you really need to know that? I don't know.
That goes back to the question of how far do you need to know in this thing to be expert enough to call yourself a full stack engineer? I tend to trust Daniel Stenberg. He's got a reasonable voice, creator of Curl. Curl is one of the most successful open source projects in the history of software, open source software. And here he is saying HTTP is not easy. And I trust him when he says that. Now, knowing HTTP is a protocol with which we tend to communicate in front-end and back-end projects, tend to always, is it impossible to be expert in just front-end and back-end?
Yeah, I honestly don't think it is anymore. People may claim that. So, this is a story about me. So maybe I'm just not as clever as I used to be. But I've been focusing on back end stuff now for at least close to a decade, I guess. I consider myself to be pretty competent with multiple types of database systems. I consider myself to be at least surface level competent in distributed systems. I know I've used all 3 major cloud services. I understand bits and pieces of them, but I and I've done, I don't know, probably 24 APIs for various things now.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody came to me tomorrow and said I need a GraphQL API, I would have to go look it up and study that and figure out how it works. Never done a GraphQL. Even with focus on backend for 10 years, I've never done a GraphQL. I've only done WebSockets one time. So there's just, even calling yourself a backend specialist is a very difficult thing to do now. You almost have to be like a particular type of backend specialist.
I would bet that you could spin up a GraphQL service pretty quickly, though. I'd give you a week and I bet you could do it. But then by the end of the week, you'd be like, are you sure you want this? I don't think you really want this.
The reason that came to mind is I was just looking at a diagram of Netflix's architecture, and apparently they are GraphQL based. So I should probably know that. But
when I look at these domains now, front end, back end, I think what would be the knowledge I would expect someone who's a front end, back end specialist? We'll call them full stack for the purposes of this conversation. Front end's all async, JavaScript, maybe TypeScript. A lot of state-based problems. So we're dealing with async state. That's already massively complex. And then you're rendering things. You've got this user interface, which usually involves display and some aesthetic decisions, right? Often we use CSS on the web. Typically, we're using CSS on the web. And then you've got this massive, infinite bazaar of the JavaScript ecosystem. And this is a lame comment, but I look at JavaScript projects today and I look at them, I'm like, wow, they sure need a lot of files to just deploy this one project. Like 24 files or 3 files in the root directory of a JavaScript project. It's like, wow, that's a lot of files. It's linting and configure formatting, and then you've got your test configuration. And maybe you have this in other projects too. You compare this to backend, and backend may be async, but it may also be sync. And a lot of the backend knowledge seems to be when and how do I connect to other things? Like when do I use PostgreSQL? When do I use a cache database or a search server or things like that? When do I use a document data store? I've also need to inject configuration and secrets management into my backend service. Maybe I'm dealing with my logs and log aggregation. And maybe, like you said, observability. Maybe that's part of the knowledge too. Maybe a little bit, maybe not as much as we were saying before, but a little bit about deployment. I don't need to be able to configure segmented networks in the cloud, but I need to be able to package my software up so that it can be deployed somewhere. So I guess we could probably agree companies, when they're asking for full stack developers, they're not looking for experts in these things. But I guess the question then becomes, well, what are they seeking? And your question is why? Why are there so many LinkedIn results? I guess I would argue if a company advertises a full stack developer role, I want to know, what are they building? A lot of times it's web stuff. And really what they probably want implicitly is, can you contribute to our React projects and can you contribute to whatever we're doing on the back end? And that feels quite a lot narrower than saying full stack developer.
My take is that companies are still sort of seeking, well, two things. One is I think some companies just want to hire as few people as possible. And they think that by hiring somebody who can work on all levels of the stack, they need fewer people. I think that's a complete miscomprehension of what the idea is behind full stack.
You're
But
saying there's like a pointy-headed manager business decision, which is like, hey, this would be a lot cheaper if we just hired fewer people. Let's find someone who can do everything, and we'll put them to do everything. What if I told you, hey, there's a software engineering team in this org, and that software engineering team decided they wanted to hire a full stack engineer to help them with their projects. Does that change what you're like? It's a little less cynical, maybe.
so the other reason why I think companies, even engineering managers who are hiring people, sort of like the idea of full stack developers, is because, and this is cynical, I admit, is because they are somewhat fungible. Meaning, if they don't work out on one project, you can put them on another. But also, if you hire somebody who's a deep distributed systems backend specialist and they turn out to be, crucial to your project, you can't really go out and hire another one of those easily. So I think people like this idea of people who can be replaced easily with another person of the same skill set.
Oh, people are fungible. Wow, that's very businessy, non-sexy way to talk about the people you work with, who we hire in our organizations. I think going back to your point about, you didn't believe at the time 10 years ago that you could call yourself full stack. Now you don't believe it's really possible for people to call themselves full stack. Implicit in what you're saying, the inference I'm drawing here is, these fields that we've identified, they never seem to get simpler, do they? They will sometimes reinvent stuff that has existed in the past. Our industry is famous for doing that. But overall, any particular area of knowledge only seems to get more complicated over time. So, for example, if I find someone, I pluck them, I give them a time machine, and maybe it's 6 years ago, and they know React. I bring them forward 6 years in time. Are they still going to be an expert in front end software dev today? It's like that area of knowledge is a pool of water that just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And knowing that, how could anybody possibly be a full stack engineer? The amount of stuff you'd have to continually, perpetually learn, the depth of that pool of water as it gets deeper and deeper and deeper, that you have to plumb the depths of, it just seems impossible. You wrote on your blog post, specialization is the norm now, and the specialties get more narrow every year. Is that really what's happening? Stuff is never going to get simpler, is it?
That's my belief. Yeah, I think a good example lately is that we've had data scientists and data engineers now for 10 years. It's been a recognized title for quite a while now. And a data engineer is typically somebody who is a software engineer with some connection to data science. Knows the operation of things like scikit-learn or PyTorch or things like that.
Knows not to judge us data scientists for, once again, not submitting any tests with their code. Okay,
Right.
that's fine. I'll do it for you. That's how I think of the data engineer.
You built your model in a Jupyter notebook. Oh boy.
Great. I will operationalize that for you once again.
um, yeah, exactly. But so now we have LLMs and we have people working on applications that call LLMs, and we've decided the field has already decided that data engineers and data scientists are not specialized enough to do those things, and so now there's this emerging field of AI engineering.
Mm,
There's people who are calling themselves prompt engineers,
mm.
that kind of thing, and I just it's possible that maybe the AIs get so sophisticated that they eliminate a lot of these subspecialties. But um, my feeling is that it's very very difficult now to even be broadly a back end engineer or a front end engineer. I don't know too much about front end stuff anymore, but it seems like it would be hard to be expert in all of the technologies that go into building a front end. Like for instance, we have design and UX specialists in a lot of companies now. So
Mhm.
even if you are competent with the frameworks, you may not be the person doing the visual layout and the human interaction stuff on that site.
I wanna come back to a post that you shared with me. It was written in 2019 by Rachel Andrews. Rachel Andrews, sorry. Rachel Andrews works at Google, and she's a technical writer there. She does content. She's a lead on content for WebDev and developerchrome.com. There's a person who's been doing web development since the mid 90s. It's a person who's an expert on CSS. I think I can say that, an expert on CSS. I am not an expert on CSS. She starts this post in a way I really liked. Everyone is angry about CSS again, she writes, which is just like there's so much in there already. And maybe we could talk just briefly, like just a little bit of context. Software engineers, people like us, often complain about CSS. I often don't like trying to get the box to be in the middle of the damn page. We get real mad about that. Anyway, that's probably what she's talking about. But she continues. I'm not even going to try to summarize the arguments. However, it always seems to boil down to the fact that CSS is simultaneously too easy to bother with, yet so hard it needs to be wrapped up in a ball of JavaScript in case it scares the horses. I just love this paragraph. Yeah, it's like I always got so annoyed when I got asked to do CSS because I just would get so frustrated and I couldn't do it really competently. I suck at it. I still suck at it. I just do enough to get it close to what I want and then I walk away. I am not an expert in it.
Same.
And I have used these tools that use JavaScript to like bundle it all together and I don't even know what they're doing below the surface and I don't care. And in a way, she's right. She's critical of this type of move. I'm treating it as like a ball of radioactive waste.
there's a there's a phenomenon that happens with CSS, and I think it's true of technologies broadly, where you have these things and they seem kind of messy and complicated, and so you build a thing around them.
Yeah.
Like, so for instance, I've been using Tailwind recently, and I like Tailwind, and it makes life simpler in a lot of respects. But the thing about Tailwind is I don't feel like I am thereby exonerated from ever learning anything about CSS.
Mm.
So it's not a replacement for CSS. It's sort of a simplifier for CSS. So
Well, you gave the example of an ORM earlier.
yeah,
Doesn't an
ORM
ORM
is
fit
yeah,
into?
it's exactly the same thing I was thinking, is that, an ORM is something that basically takes away the necessity to think too much about writing SQL and making tables and worrying about fields and
It puts those sweet little rubber buffers on the edges of all the furniture, so you can't bonk your head on it that easily.
right. With the consequence that you get a 90% solution, and then there's this 10% of stuff that doesn't work, and
Hmm.
you have to go learn the details of SQL and databases and indexes and all that stuff. And I
Hmm.
think it's the same with something like Tailwind, is that it's a 90% solution, but it kind of obscures the 10% that you're going to eventually have to know to make things actually work.
Hmm.
I'm sure there's a name for this phenomenon, but Yeah, I like what she's saying here, and I think it's kind of what made me think of this topic. You know, there was a time when 40 years ago when I started messing around with computers, you could do almost anything on your desktop computer that people could do with, you know, the computer at their company.
Hmm.
It was, you know, probably smaller scale, but like I was doing scientific computing on a desktop computer 40 years ago, and it was slow and not as I couldn't do the scale that you would do on a department computer or a supercomputer, obviously. But now, if you want to buy a computer with a desktop computer with this consumer grade GPU, you're looking at more than $5,000. If you're looking at you doing GPU stuff in the cloud, you're looking at anywhere from 50 cents to $5 an hour to rent time on those machines. And it just feels like she's saying in the essays, there's certain fields now where there's really no entry point if you are a
Yeah.
beginner.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I wanted to get to her conclusion. I have to say, I feel like she levels this charge about it's too easy to bother with, but so hard that we got to bundle it inside JavaScript so it doesn't scare the horses. I love that line, but I read that and I think, ooh, you got me. Guilty as charged. There are areas of knowledge which I am not that interested in, but I do not want to commit the sin of looking at people who are interested in that and sort of waving my hand and being like, their knowledge is not valuable or not complex or not difficult. I've seen this with backend developers who are backend specialists. They look at the front end and they go, ugh, that's just whatever. And they kind of dismiss it or hand wave it away. And that stuff is not freaking easy. Otherwise, it'd be so easy that I could just not have to even learn it, right? What I want is someone to wrap up this thing I don't want to get close to in a very easy box. And I just shove the key in that they gave me and I open the lock and magic pours out of it. And I don't have to learn it and I don't have to do very much. There are areas of knowledge that's the experience that I want. And although the promise is that regularly, we talked earlier about building things to pad other things. The reality is you still usually need to know. So I want a nice, safe package to not have to do things I don't want to do. But the promise never is realized for that safe package.
I just think it goes back to the point that she's making is that it does connect to our original premise, which is that it's very difficult to be a full stack person now. But I think part of that is because, as she's implying here, you could sit down and still write a web app that is just HTML and just plain request response. All that would still work.
Mm-hmm.
People
To
would
see
still
the
do
rise
it.
of something like HTMX, which is trying
Yeah.
to make it simpler for people who don't want to commit to JavaScript frameworks.
But that is not what people consider to be professional programming anymore. You know, it's a useful pedagogical experience, but it's not what's really happening in the software engineering world right now.
So before we throw away entirely this term full stack developer, I do want to close with Rachel Andrews' comment at the end of her essay. This is what she ends with. And I think that I want to give her the last word here. She writes, I might be the quote old guard, but if you think I'm incapable of learning React or another framework and am defending my way of working because of this, please get over yourself. However, 22-year-old me would have looked at those things and run away. If we make it so that you have to understand programming to even start, and an aside here for me is she's saying start in web development, then we take something open and enabling and place it back in the hands of those who are already privileged. I have plenty of fight left in me to stand up against that. I felt like almost an accusation as I read this essay, but I like the essay. One is here you are again, you're hand waving away things like CSS. You could just learn it and then you wouldn't have to be scared of it. And the other is traditionally web dev has been pretty egalitarian. You can show up and contribute. Yeah, we've talked about how much expertise you need to be able to be an expert in those things now. And obviously that's pretty vast. But for many, many years, decades, people can show up, they can learn a little bit of these things: HTML, CSS, JavaScript, maybe another language for the back end. And already that sounds like a lot of knowledge, but you could do that in a relatively short amount of time, and then you could bootstrap yourself into an application. And Rachel Andrew here is saying we're shutting the door a little bit by maybe making the knowledge required so massive just to get started. She's saying we're losing something by just dismissing this idea of the full stack developer. What do you think?
I agree. I think one thing I would say to sort of clarify my original point was that I'm not happy about the end of the full stack developer. You know, I was a hacker from the beginning. You know, I did not go through computer science curricula. In fact, when I was in college, there really weren't undergraduate computer science curricula. So I am largely self-taught, and I think it would be much, much harder for a person to do that in general now. You know, everybody has a computer now. You know, every 12-year-old has a laptop, but I think it would be much harder to sit down and write useful applications on that laptop than it was 40 years ago when I had a cheap desktop. And I think that's sad. I agree with her premise. I I think it should be. I think it would be nice if people had the ability to write applications and really sort of understand how that computer works too. Not just you always see people trying to write languages or low code applications that let people do things in a more simplified way, which is fine. But I would also like to people to have the ability to do programming in the same way that real programmers do programming on their computers, which I don't know if people can do that anymore.
And the history of these areas of knowledge getting further and further specialized doesn't indicate to me that it's going to be the arrow doesn't point towards simplification. So maybe you're right. Maybe people can't do that, and there's not a lot of hope that they will be able to in the future either.
Yeah, maybe quantum computers will replace everything in another decade, and you have to be a full stack quantum developer then.
Or the AI promise. I'll have my own specialization and everything I don't want to do, well, the AI thing will do that for me. All right. This has been another episode of Picture Me Coding with Eric Aker and Mike Mall. Mike, thanks for bringing this topic up, talking to me about it this week.
You're welcome.
We will see you again next week, my friend.
Hope so.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.